And so today, kind of what I have in front of me, I just have, you know, my watercolor paper that I've often been using. I do have some mixed media paper. I just have a variety of different paint brushes. I have, you know, my paper towel, my water. I always have my pencil, masking tape. I've got a cup of some palette knives, just different palette knives. And then I just have some different acrylic paints here. I do, you know, I always talk about my Liquitex basics that I love so much. So I do have some of those. I do have some of these little kind of, they're the Royal Land Nickel acrylic little tubes of color. I have a little Liquitex white soft body. So I kind of have a little variety. I do have a little sponge. This is just like a kitchen cleaning sponge that I cut up to make it into this cube shape. And then I do have some acrylic mediums today. These are acrylic mediums that I recommend most for beginners, and I'll talk about how to use them today. And so the ones I have, I think they're all mostly, 3 of them are Liquitex brand and 1 is Blick, but any brand will work. But something that says gloss medium, it could say and varnish, but it doesn't need to say and varnish. So a gloss medium. And then I also have a matte medium. Okay, and you'll notice that doesn't say and varnish, so that's what I meant. It doesn't matter if it says that, but what the varnish means is you can use it to coat a painting at the end of it and put it over the entire painting. So that's all that means. But the gloss, of course, is going to have a glossy finish. The matte will have a matte finish, but these 2 mediums essentially work the exact same way. It's just the finish is different. And then I have, this is a brand called Blick, but Liquitex also makes this as well as other brands. This is called modeling paste. So this is how you get a lot of really fun texture in your paint. So I'm going to show you that today. And this is going to change your world, especially for painting flowers. This is a beginner's best friend. I'm going to try to, so you can hopefully see it maybe. Try to my camera. There we go. So it's called Slow Dry Blending Medium. It's also known as retarder sometimes. And you can get this in different brands. It doesn't need to be Liquitex. This is just what I happen to have. But this is going to extend the acrylic paint, its wet time, okay? And it's going to make it slow down how fast it dries. So what that means is when we see blending medium is it's going to allow us to blend our paint a lot easier than just straight from the jar. So that's why this is really nice, especially when you're beginning, because it just gives you a little bit more time to get familiar with your paint and get comfortable with some of the techniques without worrying about it drying. Because, you know, I've mentioned this before, but I think the fact that acrylic paint dries so fast is one of beginner painters' biggest frustrations, because they haven't learned how to work fast yet. And so when it dries quickly on them, they get frustrated. So this is a nice, and you don't need a big jar of it at all, but like a little jar of some kind of blending medium or retarder will be really, really helpful. So as far as supplies, that's basically all I have. Most of what I'm doing, you can probably do with supplies you have already, but you know, like I said, those mediums are a nice thing to pick up if you're wanting to improve your acrylic painting techniques. So the first thing we'll talk about is just kind of the consistency of acrylic paint in a minute. So I'm going to just grab a little bit of this bright aqua green straight from the tube. Now, the thing I love about acrylic paint is if you ever buy any of those like cheap 50-cent craft paints, do you have any of those?
No, just like watercolor, cheap watercolor paint, but we have like the acrylics.
Okay, because I was going to say, like, I remember when I was younger and I couldn't afford, you know, more expensive supplies, I would often go to like Walmart or Joann Fabrics and I would buy like the 50-cent little craft paints. Now, those are great. They still work. A lot of these techniques will work. You can do mediums with them. But the one thing you'll note is you don't have the body that you'll get from like this type of paint. So when I squeeze this onto my palette initially, I'll just kind of hold it up so you can see it. Okay, it's got body. It's you know, it's got that form to it. Whereas if I squeeze craft paint on there, it just kind of spreads out into a pool. So that right there is the biggest difference, is we've got body in our paint. So that's going to allow us to paint thick layers. So if I take some paint directly from here and just paint, it's going to be nice and thick. And it's going to hold this thickness. And that texture I got from my brush, that will stay. So that's one nice thing about acrylic paint. But I can do what's called a wash. And I know you've learned a little bit about washes from me already. And so you already know that if you take a little bit of water and mix it in with that acrylic paint, you're going to get a totally different effect with that acrylic paint. Okay, so it's like I didn't mix any white with it. I didn't do anything different there except add a little bit of water. That's it. So right there, we know we can get tons of different textures just with paint and water by itself. But one thing I want to mention about acrylic paint is it's made out of two main ingredients. So we have our pigment, which is the color, and then we have something called a binder. And the binder is essential to hold the paint together and make it long lasting. Now, if I mix too much water with my acrylic paint and create maybe like this type of look, like very watercolor washy, this might not be archival or adhere to the paper long term. So what I can do instead is mix one of these in with it, because this is acrylic based, it's got binder in it, but it's also going to make my paint more fluid, flowy, liquid, translucent, all the stuff water would do, but it's going to keep it looking like acrylic paint. So, I mean, it's a little tricky to see on here, but I'll do a little bit of the matte medium. You don't need a ton, and you can, I just put some, and it looks like Elmer's glue, really is the best way I think to describe it, or like Mod Podge kind of. You can actually use this like Mod Podge, like an adhesive too. So you can do collage with this as well. But I'll take some and just, if I mix this with the paint without all that water, I can get a similar effect, but my paint is going to be archival. It's going to bind to the paper.
Did you say archival?
Archival, yes. It's going to stay. It's going to be permanent. Whereas this, it could flake off eventually because there's no binder. Okay, so yeah, this is straight water. This is with medium. So what I would say is you're safe to dilute, I would say like 25 to 30% water is okay. Any more than that, you're going to risk losing that binder. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so basically instead of using water, you use the that substitute to bind it, or would you call it
the medium. Yep, so the gloss or the matte medium, exactly. Yep, and one little tube of this is gonna last you, or bottle of this will last you a really long time.
Can you use that as a wash as well before you paint?
Yes, you can. Absolutely. You can basically, and you can use some water with it too. So what you could do is, let's say, take a little 25 to 30% water, mix that with your paint, then add some of the medium in there too. So you can have really full control over washes and different effects as far as that goes. And what you're going to find, again, it's a little tricky to see on my camera here. But now that this is dried, I mean, this really looks like watercolor to me. But this, like if I turn it, there's a little bit of a sheen to it that this does not have because the water took the binder away. So
and the water, that looks like a true watercolor where it kind of concentrated at the bottom.
Exactly.
Okay.
And you're not going to get that with the binder, or sorry, with the medium, because it's preserving your binder. So it's kind of the first thing to think about. And then kind of playing along with some of these same ideas, a watercolor technique you may have heard of is called wet on wet. And it's where I'm taking my paper, and my water is a little tinted from my paint, but that's okay. But I'm just taking some water, and like you can see a little of my paint color. Again, that's just because my water's tinted. But then after I put some water down, I take some more paint and I drop it in that water. And what you'll notice is happening is it's very organic, it's very loose, it's very flowy. So again, this is just done with water, but I can bring some of that acrylic medium into here too. Or perhaps, here, let's maybe add another color into this. We've got a lot of that aqua, maybe put a little purple in there. So I can take some purple, mix that with that medium so it's a little bit more fluid. And I can kind of dot that in here. Maybe I want a little bit of water in there too, just to help it flow a little bit more. But you can create kind of almost like tie-dye or little kind of bursts of color, which can be really fun for water or skies, or even like if you were doing a field with like flowers in the background, you could even kind of make some loose little flowers like that in the background and then have some in the foreground that are more realistic and defined. So sometimes
sorry.
No, you go ahead. You go ahead.
It looks like it could be like abstract, like in the background with the and then focusing on the main flower or whatever in the forefront.
Yes, exactly. So I think playing around with these things, just kind of on paper like this in little swatches, not really making anything, is a fun way to just see what you could come up with. You know, see what it reminds you of. And I think that will lead to more ideas. So the next kind of thing I'll talk about, and we touched base on this when we were talking about the flowers, is acrylic paint must be wet in order to blend or mix it. So one thing I did, I'll actually grab this notebook. I prepped a few squares so they were dry for me already. So these I painted like maybe a half hour ago or so. So they're pretty dry. So one thing I just want to show you is I'm going to grab a little purple, and we'll grab a little bit of that magenta color as well. Okay, so this is already dry. So if I have dry paint and I take dry paint and paint that on top, I'm going to be left with a really nice crisp edge. Okay, sometimes we want this. This is important to sometimes let layers dry so we can see something like this. Whereas if I take brushes, if I take that same kind of magenta color and paint another swatch, just like that I had before, and then I take that same purple and paint it, well, this time I'm going to get a different effect.
Oh, like a screen of the purple.
Exactly, because I painted wet paint on wet paint versus wet paint on dry paint. So that's important to consider sometimes for the effect that we're trying to achieve. So, and if I need it to blend, but I wait for this to dry, it won't blend. But the beauty of acrylic is you can always layer more magenta than more purple to get your blend. You can keep layering and layering and layering. The other thing you can do, that's when you can use some of this, that slow dry blending medium. So if I take a little bit of this and start mixing that in with my paint, maybe I want to bring some of this back over here. Well, then maybe I can start to create some blends because that's going to stay wet a lot longer for me.
So if you put that on there, you can actually take the paint that you've painted and like kind of move it over and blend it to wherever you want it to go.
As long as there's still a little bit of moisture in there, yes.
Okay.
I could not do this to this that I painted like 30 minutes ago.
Okay.
Because it's just too late for that. It's fully dry. But I was able to bring more back in here and start to create a blend of colors because there was still enough moisture in there to bring it back.
Gotcha.
If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, once that acrylic paint is dry and that moisture has evaporated completely, it becomes completely water resistant. That's why acrylic paint's so interesting, because it's water soluble, can be cleaned with water, but once it's dry, it's water resistant completely. So it's, you know, interesting material because of that. All right, let's see. So our next technique, I'll just grab this little notebook back, is called dry brush. Now, this is kind of the technique that you pull all the brushes that you maybe would have dubbed ruined because maybe you didn't rinse them out good enough, or there's some dry paint in there, or they're just old or cheap or falling apart. Those are the types of brushes that are going to give you good texture. So I bought this brush a while back and I did not clean it out as good as I thought I did. This was kind of one of my moments. I was like, ah. So I did attempt to revive it, but then I dubbed it as it's going to be a dry paint brush for me now. So there's some dried paint in there. It's a little bristly. So if I take, you know, some paint on here, right, I'm going to just get some different types of effects than if I take, you know, this brush here looks very similar, but it doesn't have all those dried paint bristles in there. So if I do this, it's gonna just give me like a nice smooth look, right? Whereas now my ruined.
Sorry.
No, you go ahead. Yeah.
Talk about renew, reuse, recycle.
Exactly. Exactly. So that's why sometimes when people are recommending or like, what brushes do you like? Or what do you use? I'm like, I have everything. I have expensive brushes. I have cheap brushes. I have little kid plastic handle brushes. I have brushes that say Crayola on it. I have a brush that I paid $30 for. You know, it's kind of, there's just such a range. And I think that's why it's so good to play, because, you know, if I wanted to paint, let's say like a rustic barn or something, you know, I want some maybe texture like this on top of there to give that wood grain or that kind of old look. And then, you know, maybe you could kind of start to layer colors together too.
Gee, we got plenty of brushes like that. We should be really good at this.
See, absolutely. And then it's like you start to mix and match some of these things and you've created a fun abstract painting. So that's kind of, I think one of my little challenges is, you know, try some of these techniques all together and see what you can come up with in a painting. All right, let's see. Next one is,
or what are they called? Distressed furniture. Yeah. You could do that with painting, with that dry
totally. Yes, it's very distressed. Yeah, it gives that kind of age look. They'll sometimes refer to that as like a patina, like the patina, the surface, the quality of it. So yeah, it's I think a really fun thing to do. I'm just a sucker for texture too. I love texture. I think it makes it more interesting, you know. Which actually the next one too is a texture one, and that's the sponge. Now, like I said, this is just a basic, super basic little cleaning sponge. And I've tried all kinds of sponges. Ones with like those scrubby pads on one side. I have like some of the sea sponges. And some of those I have packed up right now. So I just have this one out. But the thing I want to mention about the sponge, just like we explored the thickness of the paint and what water can do to it, same thing applies with the sponge. So if I dip this in just a little bit of water and rinse it out and just tap on, you know, just a little bit of paint, that's going to get me one look. But if I put a lot more water into that, I'm going to get a different look. Right? It's going to be a lot softer. So, and two, you can mix medium with the gloss and the matte medium. Basically, now that you know about it, you can use it whenever. Anytime you want to dilute your paint, you can use it in the combination with any of these techniques. But so yeah, same kind of thing applies. You know, think about more water's going to kind of spread it and just create a softer look. Whereas here I'm seeing more space. I'm seeing that texture. And then sometimes I'll let this dry a little bit, and then I'll grab maybe a secondary color and kind of add that on top. So just, you know, fun ways to play with texture and let the paint interact, and, you know.
That, if you had maybe used a white or something, it reminded me of like an ocean spray. That,
yes.
One on the left. Yeah, that's pretty cool.
Absolutely. You could, like, if you did a wave or had something coming back, you could put a little bit of that on top. Absolutely. And I think that's the whole point of these techniques. I love that you're seeing things in them and you're recognizing things. I think that's the whole purpose, because then when you're sitting down and say you do want to paint an ocean landscape or something, and you're like, oh yeah, I could use a sponge, or oh yeah, I remember that dry brush technique. That might look nice here. So it's kind of like adding to your bag of tricks. So when you're painting, you just have more to pull from. And I find that's very helpful. So you're not sitting there like, well, how should I get that ocean spray? What should I do for that? And now you have some ideas.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah, I think so too. So the next one is Impasto, and I actually think, you know, you might have a whole ocean theme going on here, because I think this one would make some cool effects for ocean or water too. But this is with a palette knife. Now, if you don't have palette knives, like I can just show you, like I've got a whole bunch of different ones. Like my grandma had gifted me, this is like an actual Bob Ross one.
Oh,
I've got
wow.
like a little cheapy plastic one. I got this, you know, some different shapes. So like anything works. And if you don't have actual palette knives, I've used just like plastic knives from like cutlery sets, or even like a popsicle stick can work too. So you can be kind of creative when it comes to that. But the whole idea behind Impasto is you're not using a paintbrush at all. You're in fact kind of scooping, scraping, and spreading with a palette knife. So I usually like to make sure I've got like enough paint that I can kind of scoop it up, which I do have enough of this aqua green color. And then you can kind of take it to your paper and you could spread it. You can scrape it. You can scratch away at it. I mean, you can really do all sorts of things. Now this palette knife is not the greatest. Some of these other ones I think produce a lot cooler results. Like this one with this flat edge, I can even kind of take this and almost create like a stained look on my paper. It's like I apply the paint and then I remove it, and then it just gives me like it had stained the paper. Or maybe I want to kind of pop some of that back on, and I can kind of play around, and maybe I want to bring some of the purple in here too, and some of the medium. But you can kind of just play around with how those palette knives create texture just by simply scooping, scraping, spreading, you know, and then when I get rid of it, it's like, ooh, that's kind of fun. So it's very experimental. I definitely think it's good advice to let areas dry and then come back in with more, so it actually builds it up instead of spreading it all around. That's sometimes how we create that big mess that we're like, what is this? So that's just, you know, dry time factoring that in. But yeah, that's Impasto, just, you know, playing around with those palette knives and different combinations and just seeing what you can come up with is pretty fun. And I like palette knives too for mixing, because like I just take out my paper towel, I wipe it clean, it's ready to go, versus, you know, paintbrushes hold so much paint in their bristles all the time. So that's be a nice thing. Right. So the next one, I'm actually going to pop back over to this notebook because I need some of that dry paint again. This is one of my all-time favorite techniques, and it's called Sgraffito. And it's actually a technique across drawing, painting, ceramics. That's why it's so fun. The idea is basically scratching or like etching. So oftentimes I'll start with like a background color. I'll want something on the paper first, usually not just white. Then what I'll do is I'll take, we'll throw another color into the mix here. I'll bring a little yellow in. So I'll take a color and paint it over top of my dry paint like this. And you can do as many layers, as many colors, but while this paint is wet, all you're doing is you're scratching out designs.
Oh, like a pattern.
Like a pattern, exactly. And it could be something as simple as, okay, I'm doing like little dots like this, or it could be, you know, I'm gonna write something. It could be fur texture in an animal. It could be flower texture. It could be those lines. You know, it's just a fun way to add expression. And I can write hello. So just like a fun little way to bring some texture. And like, especially with these little circles, you know, they'll dry and you'll be able to run your finger over it and feel the bump. So it's kind of, it's fun to play around with texture in that way too, I think.
Sgraffito. Katie would like that, I think. Yeah, it's mine.
Yeah. And if you Google sgraffito and like ceramics, it's a technique in ceramics where they'll glaze like a plate or a mug or whatever they made, and they'll etch out designs. And so different glazes show through. So it's a really, it's awesome. And it's a technique, like I said, that's kind of across the art world that you'll hear in more than just painting.
How did people like come about, like, are these like patented, like sgraffito and all the other designs that you're telling me about, or the techniques? Are they actually like standard techniques, or it's like you make it up as
pretty standard from like the masters? Like if you look throughout art history, a lot of these things I showed you today are very evident in any painting. Not all of them, of course, but I think if you go look at any painting, you'll see evidence of wet on dry, of wet on wet, of sgraffito perhaps, of different washes, of different thicknesses, of different texture. So terms like sgraffito and impasto, I guess have just kind of been in the art world as much as the term like value or color kind of have been. You know, I can't tell you the name of the person who dubbed those terms as those terms. It's just sort of became a thing, just as much as, you know, I'm saying I'm doing a cartwheel, and you can probably picture in your head, this is what a cartwheel looks like. This is like a sgraffito.
It's like
does that make sense? Yeah.
Yes. I'm letting the dog in. Come on.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
All right.
But no, those are really good questions. I love all the questions you ask, because those are some of the things like I haven't thought about, because I've just been in that world or this world for such a long time that I just feel like it kind of just is, just as this is my hand, right? This is sgraffito. And
right,
so,
like oh, go ahead.
yeah.
I'm sorry.
No, you're good. No, please do. I'm chatty too, and I love that you are too.
Okay.
So just keep chatting. I love it.
You know how there's like standard typefaces?
Yeah.
They're just standard. It's like, you know, avant-garde or Helvetica, whatever. I just, you know, same idea.
Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. But yeah, I should dive in and do a little bit more like heavy duty research, you know, like to kind of dub some of the beginnings of some of these things. I think that would be fun. Well, cool. So we've got 3 more to do. This next one is a really helpful technique for blending, and it's often how I blend most things. So just kind of for the sake of illustration, we'll do some yellow into some red, just so you can kind of see that. And there's different ways you can do this, but this is referred to as scumbling. And like scumbling, and like the other terms, stumbling is another one of those things. You're going to see it in drawing, you're going to see it in ceramics. But scumbling is basically a little circular motion with your paintbrush like this. So actually what I could do, if I want to work on this a little bit, like this was my wash, So if I've got like a little bit of red paint, just use 2 brushes, and some of this yellow paint. And yellow paint, you maybe notice this. Notice how much more opaque my red is than my yellow. Do you see that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One little tip is if you take a teensy bit of white paint and mix that in with your yellow. I don't know why yellow is this way, it just is. But a teensy bit of white will make it more opaque for you. And if it lightens your yellow too much, you can just put a little bit of like red in there or something to help balance. But yeah, white just, so now when I paint this on there, it'll just be more opaque. All right, so scumbling is basically, now that I've got these kind of 2 wet areas of color next to each other, I'm just going to, with a circular motion, start dragging my paint down into the other color. And then I'll do the same thing with this paintbrush. And I'm just kind of swirling that paint up in a little motion. And again, it has to be wet for this to work. So that's where you could put a little bit of that blending medium in there, if that was helpful for you. The other thing you can do is wipe some of the excess paint off of your paintbrush so it's drier, and that will help that scumble become softer. And you can just kind of keep working that until you get it looking how you want it. And the more layers you do, the more blended it will look, which sometimes you want that and sometimes you don't. It just depends what you're trying to paint. But yeah, that's scumbling. Another way you can do scumbling is you don't have to blend. You could just do it for the texture purpose. So that would be me taking a little bit of red paint. I could go over this magenta and I could just kind of scumble in some red on top of an existing color. So this is just a way to texture or tone. And I can hold that up. I know it's a little tough to see. Those colors are very similar.
I see it.
Yeah, so those are 2 ways you can scumble. You can use it to blend, or you can use it to tone or add texture. But again, the whole idea is just little circular motions with your kind of moving your wrist, kind of like this. Just little circular motions. All right, and then let's see. Our next one too, or our next 2, I'll need just a couple little swatches of color a minute. And then if you have any questions, I can answer those. Let's do, I'm not really picking these colors for any rhyme or reason. I'm just kind of.
No, that's cool.
Yeah. So here's a little swatch of orange. And then, actually, we'll just do both little swatches of. There we go. Kind of a yellow orange. Okay. And again, I just did this to give myself a background, so I'm not painting on white paper. Because a lot of the times when you use some of these techniques, you're using them on something you've painted already, not just doing it on white. So a little swatch just gives me something to use. So this technique is called glazing. Now, glazing is an amazing technique that can be used in tons of different ways for tons of things. It's also something that you can do in watercolor painting too. So you can glaze in watercolor and acrylic painting, but if you're painting with, let's say, gouache, you cannot glaze. So the reason why is we've learned that acrylic paint, when it dries, it becomes water resistant. So if I put more paint on top of here, it won't do anything to this paint once it's dry. So with glazing, you need to have dry paint down. Now you could glaze on top of a flower petal. You could glaze on top of, let's say you were painting a bird and the bird wing, you wanted to glaze in some color. You could glaze in color in water with different effects of the different blues and greens. You could glaze in a sunset. So this could be anywhere you're trying to embed variations of color, but you don't want it to look like I just slap some paint on top, like how this purple is sitting on here. It's a more subtle way to bring color in. So you can glaze with just water. My water is looking pretty dirty right now because I've got a lot of brushes in there. So I'm going to glaze with my matte medium. You can also glaze with, they actually make a medium called Glazing Medium. So you can buy that. I do have a little jar of it. I don't have it over here, so I'll just use this. But a lot of times for beginners or my students, I'll say, just use matte medium. That way you don't have to buy a ton of different stuff. You've already got it. So what you'll do is you'll take just a little bit of matte medium, and I can spread that out. And I'm gonna pick another color. Now this could be any color I want to sort of glaze into here. I could go magenta, I could go red, I could go yellow, whatever I want to do to this. Or I could go total opposite and start glazing in blues because it's complementary. But I'm gonna go kind of more with like the magenta. I'm kind of feeling the warms instead of going contrasting right now. So glazing, I'll just take a little bit of that color and mix it in with the medium. So now I've got like a very translucent magenta. So glazing, you always work thicker first and then you're finishing with lighter. So it's like you're going backwards. You're not washing and building up thicker, you're going thicker to lighter. So then to glaze, and this may be a little tricky to see, I'll hold it up in just a second. It's really pretty actually. I'm just lightly glazing this magenta I've made on top of this orange, and I can do different amounts of it, but I'll hold it up, see if you can see this.
I see it. It's super pretty.
Right?
Yeah.
Isn't that pretty? It's very subtle. And so when you're looking at something in person, and I can let this dry and glaze more and build up more, and it's a layers game. And the more you glaze, the more you can change it and get different effects with it. And it's different than just mixing two colors together. If I mix the magenta with that orange, it's not the same, right? So it's just a fun way to get a different effect.
That's interesting. I like that.
Yeah. Yep, and exactly like I said too, watercolor you can glaze too. So if you did a big opaque swatch of watercolor, let that dry, and then did a wash on top of it, you're gonna get similar results. The only difference is you wouldn't use a medium in watercolor, you just use water, of course. So, but I don't know if you know much about gouache paint, but gouache paint is a type of paint that water will always activate it, even if it's on paper. So you can't glaze a type of paint like that, because if you glaze something you've just painted, it'll bring it all back up again. So that's why this technique is very special and unique to acrylic and watercolor for those particular properties. All right, so I'm going to show you one last technique today, and this is another blending technique. So that's why I did just a little swatch here, and I actually just maybe see this a little better. Let's see, I think I can zoom. There we go. Sometimes that's easier to see. Okay, so I'm gonna do some blue and green, I think. We'll just go a little contrasting on this kind of light yellow orange I got going on. So this is another way to blend, and this is called cross-hatching. And this is also a term for drawing too. I have 2 paintbrushes here, and I'm using 2 paintbrushes just so I can work quickly and show you, but you can do this with one, you just have to clean it off kind of a lot. So that's why I like to use 2. So I'm gonna start by just laying down some of this blue paint. And then same thing with my green. Now this green is a little bit like that yellow, where if I put just a smidge of white with it, it'll make it more opaque. Some of those lighter colors, it just helps. So now this is not a hyper realistic smooth blend. This is a more kind of textured blend. But basically what you're going to do with your 2 colors now is you're going to start dragging them into each other. So I go one way with that brush, And then I can take this brush and start to go this way. Then I can start to bring more of this color back in here too. That's okay, you can bring more color in. But the idea is to just start to get a nice little blend in between these two colors. And playing around with different brushes and different size brushes are going to produce like different results. You know, and sometimes I like to see a lot of contrast. Sometimes I want it a little bit smoother. But this can just be a really fun way to bring two colors together in a different way. You could also stipple the two colors, meaning dot them instead of doing lines. So this isn't going to be the best example, but you know, I could just dot the two together and do that transition as well.
I like that.
But you know, you think about like flower petals or butterfly wings, or you know, anything that's, I think, found in nature, it doesn't always have those beautiful perfect blends. There's those little kind of fun texture, like, I don't even want to say imperfections, but you know what I mean, like those little inconsistencies perhaps that make it unique and fun. So I think playing around with these textures and things just help bring a component of that into your painting.
Okay, so you're gonna think I'm cuckoo, but my husband got me tulips for our anniversary, yellow ones. But the way that you drew that blue, it looks like an abstract tulip. And as soon as you started cross hatching, it looks like the subtle change in colors, like I know it's
no, I love that. That's so cool.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I like
totally.
And I'm picturing the flowers that I have and how it's not just the one color. It's got that subtle changes.
And these are great ways to capture that through glazing, through cross hatching. It's funny that you said tulips, because that's actually the flower I was thinking about doing for my first painting class. It's going to be some tulips.
Now, in our first class, when we had the beginning drawing and we had the dark color, and then we went lighter, we added white and did all that to show like the transformation. Could we use one of these techniques instead of what you showed us? You
Absolutely.
know what I mean? Like a lot of this, I think, could be applied to. These are stupid questions. I'm not an artist, but
no, they're not stupid questions at all. They're good questions.
Instead
I think
of
they're
like,
really good questions.
Okay. So just utilizing one of these techniques as like the cross hatching instead of adding, you know, white or something like that. And just,
exactly. You've got it. Because when I showed you the flower, that was more about process of applying the paint. Like, I didn't even really care what my flower was looking like, because I just wanted you to know this is the order you go in. This, you know, we only have a short block of time, so that was more my concern. But now that you've kind of learned some of these things, now you can take this and bring it into what you've learned before. And then when I teach the next class, I will start talking about multiple things, and you know, I might mention, okay, now we're going to scumble here and do this a little bit more than I did before, because you hadn't learned those techniques yet. So if I just started talking about scumbling or glazing, you'd be like, what?
Yeah.
So I more or less wanted to show you the step by step. So I think everything I'm teaching you, it's all connected. These are all building blocks. You can pick, you can choose, you can make choices. And that's the beauty of making art, I think. Like I said before, it's having your bag of tricks and deciding, what do I need to pull out now to create what I'm trying to make, or to get this looking like this petal of this particular tulip, or, you know, whatever you're trying to make. It's just having more skills and more solutions for essentially the problem you're solving.
I have to get out of that way of thinking, well, this is how it's done. You do that. Well, not really. You can tweak it any which way that you want to.
Exactly. Exactly. And that's the thing about art. Yes, there
Mm-hmm.
is skill. Yes, there is technique. Yes, it does require practice. But, you know, if you look at, you know, art history throughout time, when we started seeing artists breaking the mold, they, you know, it's like when we saw Picasso, nobody was doing that. People were like, wait a second, like, that's not how you do art. And he was
Mm-hmm.
kind of like, well, why not? So it's kind of, yeah, you get to choose for yourself. I think it's just learning skills, and like you're doing, you're asking questions, and you're getting
Mm-hmm.
to form it and make it for yourself, because you're the artist, you know, and you
Gotcha.
get to do it your way. So that's the beauty of it.
Yep. This is really interesting.
Well, good. I'm
Yeah,
glad
I
that
like this.
you've got some, you know, found some stuff that you liked, and hopefully some things you could try on your own. And even if it's just a page in your sketchbook that's trying out some of these, like in this fashion, it doesn't even have to be anything. It could just be playing. You know, I
Yep.
always say, it sounds cheesy. I tell my students this all the time. I'm like, it's like you're dating the acrylic paint, and you got to get to know it. Right? Like, you've got to
It's true.
ask it questions and like see what it can do, and like discover
It's
its potential. And I think once you start to do that yourself, you feel more comfortable, and you start to understand how it works and its properties for painting a flower, painting a seascape, or whatever you're
yeah.
doing.
It's it's very it's good. I really appreciate this, Jennifer.